The land didn't roll so much as press flat blistered endless. Heat wavered over it like a lie bending the horizon until even hope seemed to tilt. For 2 days, Clara had walked that straight line, and for 2 days, the sun had hammered her into something stubborn and narrow, a mother who refused to lie down. Dust clung to her hem and found her throat. Each breath tasted of grit. Behind her, small fingers tugged at her skirt. Ruth, her little girl bonnet, two big cheeks hollowed into crescents. Children believe their mothers can carry them anywhere. Clara let the child believe. Her shawl, once a bright Sunday blue, had stiffened with salt. She draped it over Ruth's shoulders when the girl stumbled, and she said the only magic word she had left. Shade soon, water soon. I won't let you go. The phrases came out like threadbare prayers, patched and repatched, but a promise spoken softly can steady a child's feet for one more mile. Overhead buzzards stitched slow circles into the sky, patient as undertakers. Ruth peered up and asked if the birds were watching them. Just passing, Clara whispered, but the lie weighed more than the shawl. 2 days earlier, the town had spit them out like a seed. She had carried Ruth down its main street boards, hot windows, bright men leaning in doorways, with the easy courage of full bellies, and asked for water. Laughter answered first, the high clatter of it knocking against her ribs. A peddler offered pity with his eyes, but kept his hands in his pockets. The sheriff, boots polished and heart untroubled, told her to keep moving. Said the town wasn't a place for strays. He never looked at Ruth, which was easier than seeing. Clara's chin stayed high until the town shrank behind them. Pride can look like dignity from a distance. Up close, under a merciless sun, it looks like thirst. She tried not to think of the man who had promised shelter, and then vanished when the word family grew heavy. Charm comes cheap in the territories. Marrow is expensive. His absence echoed in Ruth's eyes the way a church bell echoes after it's done ringing loudest when the sound is supposedly over. The memories came back like heat mirages, cruel and convincing, a door closing, a boot turning, a voice promising to send for them soon. Clara tightened her hold on Ruth's hand and kept walking. By late day, the shadows lengthened but refused to cool. Clara lifted Ruth's muscles, blazing in protest, and felt with terror how light her daughter had become. There is a kind of lightness no mother wants to feel. Her foot caught in a rut. She fell to her knees, palms smacking the hard earth. Ruth didn't cry. Even tears had dried up. Clara pressed her forehead to the dust-counting breaths until her head stopped swimming, then pushed herself up and staggered on. That was when she saw it, a lone mesquite, crooked as an old finger, casting a patch of shade that looked far bigger than it was. Salvation, no. But something. They reached the meager shadow, and Clara slid down the trunk, with Ruth pulled to her chest. The ground radiated heat even in darkness. She pressed her palm against the child's back, as if courage could seep through skin. The sky softened into copper and rose a beautiful cruelty, an evening made for dances and porch songs, not for a woman and a girl whose hunger had stolen their voices. Far out on the flats, a sound began, hoofbeats slow, and even the kind of rhythm that belongs to someone who doesn't need to hurry. Clara's spine tightened. Help and harm arrive on the same road. She tucked the shawl tighter around Ruth and kept her eyes on the wavering line where the world lifted into sky. Dust rose behind the rider, a faint veil turned gold by the dying sun. Is help coming? Ruth rasped. Rest, Clara said, kissing the hot crown of her daughter's head. She could promise nothing else. The hoofbeats grew clearer, spreading into the silence, until the silence changed shape. Clara leaned her head back against the bark, breathed through the burn in her lungs, and waited. This was the hinge, she felt it, where a life swings one way or the other. Ruin or mercy, a stranger or a savior. Another door slammed, or one finally opened. The rider drew near enough to be real tall in the saddle posture, easy but attentive, his horse moving with the certainty of a creature that knows the land and has made a truce with it. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply reined in at a respectful distance and studied the picture before him, a mother in rags, a child too tired to hold up her head, and a scrap of borrowed shade. Clara's mouth-shaped words, "Keep riding. We're fine, we can manage." But Ruth stirred and whimpered, breaking whatever pride was left to break. The man swung down with deliberate calm. Leather creaked, dust whispered. He crouched, pulled a canteen from his saddle, and offered it without speeches, without questions, without the stink of pity. "Water," he said, voice low and even. Clara held his gaze for half a heartbeat, then pressed the canteen to Ruth's lips. The girl drank hard, coughing at first, then softer. Clara waited until Ruth's breathing steadied before taking a shallow swallow for herself. It tasted like forgiveness. The man Thomas, she would learn, didn't smile. He didn't frown. He only stayed a steady weight in a world that had felt weightless and cruel. And in that small shaded patch with the sun rolling away and the sky cooling from copper to violet, the story began to turn. The mesquite tree was no miracle, but Clara made herself believe in its sliver of shade. She pressed her back against the rough trunk Ruth cradled, close the child's breaths, shallow and ragged against her collarbone. Each wheeze cut sharper than the sun itself. Clara's hand smoothed over her daughter's hair, brittle as straw, and she whispered promises that no longer held weight. "Just rest, darling. Mama's got you." The ground beneath them radiated heat, the air thick with dust. Yet overhead the sky burned into colors so cruelly beautiful, it mocked her suffering, copper bleeding into rose. The sort of sunset meant for dances on wooden porches, not for a woman watching her child slip away. From far across the flats came a new sound, threading through the silence like fate itself, hoofbeats. Slow, even. Not the wild thunder of pursuit, nor the hurried scramble of flight. A rhythm steady as a heartbeat, growing louder with each breath Clara drew. She froze, every muscle wound tight. In her chest, two truths fought. A lone rider might mean salvation. A lone rider might mean ruin. Desperation had taught her not to trust easily, especially in men who appeared when a woman was most exposed. She pressed her lips to Ruth's temple, tasting salt and dust, whispering, "Close your eyes, sweetheart. Rest now." She could not promise more. She could only hope the sound of her voice might shield the child from the uncertainty riding toward them. The hoofbeats came closer, measured, unhurried, as though the man astride the horse owned not just his mount, but the very rhythm of the land. Dust lifted behind him, glowing in the last blaze of the sun. Clara narrowed her eyes against the orange glare, trying to make out his shape. For a breath she wished he would pass them by, leaving her to endure the slow death she already knew. For another fiercer breath she prayed he would stop, that Grace might wear spurs and ride out of the horizon. The world tilted on that edge, buzzards circling tighter above shadows, stretching long and thin across the flats. Clara didn't move. She held Ruth tighter, listening to the final approach, heart clenched between fear and fragile hope. She understood in her bones the next few moments would mark the split in her story, where life bent toward ruin or at last toward grace. The sun had fallen low when the rider came into full view. Clara's eyes narrowed against the blaze of orange, caught the shape of him tall in the saddle. Broad-shouldered, his posture steady as a tree that had weathered every storm the plains could throw. His horse moved with the calm rhythm of miles, already mastered hooves, striking the dirt in an unhurried cadence. This was no reckless drifter, no man fleeing or chasing. This was someone who matched his pace to the land, bowing to its tempo instead of fighting it. Clara's spine stiffened. Instinct made her brace. A stranger was no less dangerous for being measured. When he reined in, the silence pressed harder than the heat. He didn't call out, didn't wave, didn't make a show of greeting. He simply studied her from the saddle hat brim, shading his eyes, body still as stone. Clara forced herself upright against the mesquite's trunk, Ruth limp in her arms. She wanted to spit words, "Keep riding. We need nothing." But her lips cracked on the attempt, pride and exhaustion tangling in her throat. The man finally dismounted, every movement, deliberate boots crunching the hard earth. He led the bay closer, then stopped a few paces away, neither threatening nor familiar. The distance was intentional, respectful but guarded. Clara met his gaze with one of her own, chin high despite the tremor in her knees. Then he crouched. Leather creaked as his massive frame lowered, and in his hand appeared a weathered canteen. His voice, when it came, was low and even stripped of command, stripped of mockery. Only a single word: water. No offer dressed in pity, no question prying into who she was or why she was dying on the flats. Just the things she and her child needed most laid plainly between them. Clara's pride flared for a moment. She had begged once in a town and been met with laughter, turned away like refuse. She would not beg again. Yet Ruth stirred weakly, a small hand trembling toward the canteen. The sight undid every wall Clara had built. With shaking fingers, she took it. The child drank first greedily, the water spilling down her chin in her haste. Clara steadied her daughter, whispering, as if the water might disappear if they drew too much. Only when Ruth's belly quieted did Clara tip the canteen to her own mouth. She let the liquid coat her tongue just enough to cool the fire in her throat, then lowered it. She hadn't realized she was trembling until her hand brushed against the man's rough palm as she passed it back. He said nothing. His eyes, deep beneath the shadow of his hat, gave away nothing more than steady presence. He remained kneeling in the dust weight in his silence, rather than in words. He didn't ask where she had come from. He didn't demand thanks or payment. His stillness, strange as it felt, carried more assurance than any flood of promises might have. Clara's breath hitched. She found herself holding his gaze too long before dropping her eyes to Ruth's damp lashes. When at last he stood, he gestured toward his horse. There's shade and food a mile on. Come. The simplicity of it struck like a hammer. No persuasion, no insistence. Just a door opening if she chose to walk through. Pride reared again inside her. She wanted to say she could not accept that she would not drift into another man's mercy. But Ruth sagged against her head, lolling breath shallow. Pride, Clara knew, could not feed a child. Slowly, with a sharp nod, she rose. Her legs shook, nearly giving beneath her. Before she could falter, the cowboy, Thomas, stepped forward and lifted Ruth into his arms. His touch was reverent, careful, as though holding a fragile vessel rather than a child starved half to death. He settled her against his chest with an ease that broke Clara's resistance. Then, with the same steadiness, he extended his hand toward her palm, rough fingers waiting. For a heartbeat, Clara hesitated. Then she set her hand into his, and the weight of his grip steadied her. He helped her to the saddle mounted behind her and nudged the horse forward. The mesquite shrank into the distance. The land stretched wide and merciless still, but for the first time in days, Clara felt the rhythm of something other than despair, the solid, patient presence of a man who offered no promises, only the chance to survive the next mile. Thomas moved first with the quiet certainty of a man who had long carried more than his own weight. He bent and lifted Ruth as though she were made of glass. The child, limp from hunger and heat, seemed feather-light in his arms, yet he held her with a reverence that suggested she was priceless. Clara's throat tightened at the sight. This stranger did not cradle her daughter like a burden, but like something worth protecting. Then his hand reached for Clara. Calloused, weather-roughened, steady when her palm met his, she felt the press of another life that had known both toil and endurance. Rough against rough, strength meeting strength. No pity, only balance. He helped her into the saddle, settling Ruth securely first, then guiding Clara onto the worn leather. She sat stiff at first, the unfamiliar closeness startling her. Thomas swung up behind them, his presence solid, the breadth of his chest, a wall of quiet strength at her back. With a nudge of his heel, the bay horse moved forward. The rhythm of hooves spread across the plain, steady and unhurried, carrying them away from the lonely mesquite and into the stretch of falling dusk. Shadows lengthened, the sky burned with copper and rose. For Clara, the cadence of hooves was more than motion. It was the first rhythm of safety she had known in years. As the horizon darkened, Thomas guided them toward a cluster of cottonwoods where a shallow creek shimmered with faint light. He dismounted without a word, lowering Ruth gently onto a blanket pulled from his saddle roll. Clara followed unsteady, but he gave her space, turning, instead to his horse, loosening the reins, brushing down its flanks. He did not hover, did not demand gratitude. He moved with deliberate care, giving Clara the rarest gift she had been denied in every town in hardship before, the privacy of dignity. The water murmured nearby, Ruth stirred faintly, and the air shifted softer around them. For the first time in days, the world felt survivable. The creek's murmur blended with the soft rustle of cottonwood leaves as dusk lowered itself over the camp. Thomas busied himself with small, deliberate tasks, loosening the horse's tack, gathering a handful of dry branches, striking a flame until it caught. Clara sat with Ruth curled against her side, the child's breathing shallow but steadier now. When Thomas returned, he handed Clara a coarse piece of bread from his pack. The crust was dry, almost bitter, but to Ruth, it might as well have been a feast. Clara broke it into careful portions, giving her daughter the larger share, watching her chew slowly with fragile determination. Only once Ruth was satisfied did Clara allow herself a bite. The bread tasted sweeter than honey. Thomas didn't watch her eat. Instead, he lowered himself across the fire, his hat brim shadowing his face. a pipe resting idle between his fingers. He did not light, it did not fill the silence with small talk. He seemed a man content to let the fire carry the weight of sound, the crackle of wood sparking where words might have faltered. Clara glanced at him, wary, yet curious. The question pressed up from her chest before she could stop it, her voice rough from thirst and pride. Why help us? His eyes lifted, meeting hers through the shifting light. He did not flinch from the rawness in her tone, nor did he offer the soft comfort of practiced reassurances. The silence stretched heavy but not cruel until at last he spoke with the simplicity of a man who saw no need for embellishment. Because you need it. No promise, no condition, no judgment. Just the plain truth as steady as the ground beneath them. Clara looked down at Ruth already asleep, her chest rising and falling in exhausted rhythm. Something uncoiled inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She brushed her daughter's hair back, letting the fire's warmth seep into her bones. In Thomas's quiet, she felt no demand, no ridicule, only presence. It was disarming, almost unbearable in its gentleness. For the first time in days, the air around her no longer carried the taste of despair. Closing her eyes, she allowed herself a fragile hope, small and flickering, like the fire between them, but enough to hold the night at bay. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm both unfamiliar and strangely steady. At last, Clara learned the man's name, Thomas. He spoke it without ceremony, as if it were less important than the work of his hands or the land he tended. His ranch was no sprawling estate, but it carried the dignity of endurance. A plain whitewashed house stood weathered but strong, its roof patched with care. A red barn leaned proudly against the sweep of fields, its paint peeling yet resolute. Beyond, dry grass rippled in the wind, threaded with a creek that caught the light like silver ribbon. Nothing about the place sought grandeur. It breathed of labor persistence and a quiet strength that mirrored its owner. Thomas did not welcome them with words. Instead, he opened the barn doors wide, spreading fresh hay in a corner, where Ruth could rest her small body, sinking gratefully into the softness. He set a tin plate of food where Clara could reach it, saying nothing, expecting nothing. It was not invitation yet, it was not rejection either. His silence carried a kind of assurance, as though her presence required no justification. In that quiet space, Ruth revived first, as children often do, when even a shred of kindness is offered. Her laughter, faint but real, threaded through the barn as she chased chickens across the yard, her feet finding life again in the dust. In the evenings, Thomas sat with Ruth's small shoes in his large hand, stitching the worn seams with careful precision. When she thanked him, he tipped his hat lightly and returned to his work, as if gratitude was a burden he never wanted her to carry. Clara watched her heart aching with both humility and something she dared not name. Pride, however, demanded her own offering. She rose early, hauling buckets of water from the well-scrubbing laundry until her knuckles burned mending shirts when she found them frayed at the seams. Thomas never asked, never instructed her to stop. Sometimes, though, she caught him standing on the porch in the hush of dusk, pipe unlit, his gaze steady. He did not stare with suspicion nor indulgence. Rather, he seemed to measure her endurance in silence, as though weighing whether her strength matched her stubborn pride. For Clara, it was a fragile reprieve, a life of labor without mockery, of shelter without shame. Each task she performed became proof that she still had worth. And though words remained scarce, something unspoken grew in the spaces between them, like green shoots pushing up through parched soil, determined to endure. The quiet rhythm of the ranch could not keep the outside world at bay. When Clara ventured into town with Ruth, her patched dress and weary dignity drew whispers sharper than any blade. Women at the mercantile glanced over their shoulders, murmuring about shame and impropriety. A preacher stopped her on the wooden steps, eyes shadowed beneath his hat, and spoke of temptation, of appearances that led to sin. Clara lowered her gaze and nodded politely, but each word clung to her skin, like burrs stinging long after she turned back toward the ranch. That evening, as the sun bled into a horizon of crimson and gold, Clara sat alone on the barn step. Ruth's laughter as she chased fireflies seemed distant, muted beneath the weight pressing her chest. She told herself she must leave soon before her presence ruined Thomas's good name. She had been cast aside before, and she would not allow herself to become a burden again, not to the one man who had shown kindness without demand. Her pride warred with her exhaustion, and her eyes stung with unshed tears. The crunch of boots on earth broke her thoughts. Thomas set down a lantern beside her, its glow softening the dusk. He did not question, did not prod her to speak, but his silence pressed against her trembling heart. At last she confessed in a rush, the whispers, the preacher's warning, the pity that turned her pride into ash. She braced herself for his agreement, for the inevitable reminder that she should go. Instead, Thomas studied her, the light bronzing the lines of his face, and spoke with a calmness that held more weight than thunder. Let them talk. No defense, no anger, no apology, just the solid truth of a man unmoved by gossip, a rock standing firm against the desert wind. In that moment, Clara's heart faltered, caught between fear and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found ground that would not give way beneath her feet. The test of whispers and shame had barely passed when a fiercer trial descended. One evening, Ruth's small body was seized by fever, her fragile frame burning with heat that made every breath a ragged struggle. Clara's hands shook as she pressed cool claws to her daughter's brow, whispering desperate promises into ears too weak to truly hear. Terror clawed at her chest, memories of loss threatening to drown her resolve. Thomas moved quietly through the night, a steady presence, where panic might have taken root. He fetched water from the well-split wood until his palms blistered and stoked the fire when the chill crept in. When Ruth shivered, he removed his own coat and laid it over her with the tenderness of a father. When Clara's hands faltered, trembling from fear and exhaustion, his larger palm enclosed hers, rough, calloused, yet gentle, reminding her she was not fighting alone. Hours dragged on like years. The storm outside rattled the shutters, thunder splitting the sky, but inside the ranch house, the true battle raged in silence. Thomas settled into a chair at Ruth's bedside, his hat tipped low, his broad shoulders slumping with fatigue yet never yielding. He did not leave, not even for a moment. His silence was not empty. It was the weight of someone who refused to let despair claim the room. At last, in the pale light of dawn, Ruth's fever broke. The child's breathing steadied, her body slackened into the fragile peace of recovery. Thomas, drained beyond measure, succumbed to sleep, where he sat, his chin dropping to his chest. Clara rose, her own body trembling with relief. She stepped outside as the morning sky blushed with rose and gold. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth after the storm. And there on the porch she covered her mouth as sobs overtook her, not of despair, but of something long buried, the shattering recognition that she was no longer alone. Hope, small and defiant, had returned to her heart with the breaking dawn. You're right, my last section ran short. Here's the full 310-word version. The fever had broken, but the night still clung to the rafters like damp smoke. Clara stepped into the pale rose-gold morning and felt the air move through her chest without scraping. Inside, Ruth slept in shallow, even breaths. A small ship finally passed the worst of the storm. The hope that visited was shy as a field hare, but it did not bolt when she noticed it. It sat there twitching alive. Beyond the fence line, the world remained unkind. Gossip sharpened like flint whenever her name struck it. Sermons waited like traps. Pride tugged at the old stitches in her heart. Stay or go, 2 words equally heavy. To stay meant risking the last of her armor, admitting she needed more than stubbornness. To go meant stepping back into the desert that had nearly swallowed them both. Safety was new. Leaving it would be a familiar kind of ruin. Clara gripped the porch post and breathed until the shake left her hands. She weighed the cost of mercy, of being held without debt. Could she accept kindness without fearing the bill to come due? Could she build a life without first apologizing for existing? A soft cough from the doorway. Clara turned. Thomas was there, rising from the chair where he'd kept watch, shoulders wide, eyes lined with fatigue, and something gentler. No speeches, no claims, just presence. He met her gaze in the porch. The yard, the brightening sky seemed to hush around that single steady line between them. In the silence, he said nothing and everything. You are not alone. We can carry this. She felt the choice tilt. Pride loosened, not in defeat but in relief. Clara let the morning fill her lungs and for the first time pictured staying without fear. Behind them, the creek answered softly like a promise the land would keep today. The morning broke, golden, spilling across the prairie in long ribbons of light that caught on the cottonwoods and shimmered along the shallow creek. The land looked cleansed after so many days of dust, as though the storm had scoured it raw and left only possibility behind. Inside the small room, Ruth slept in peace, her breath soft, her face finally loosened from suffering. Clara stood in the doorway, watching her child, and felt both relief and unease knotting inside her chest. Relief that Ruth was safe, at least for now. Unease because every dawn brought the same truth: she was living in a house that was not her own, on kindness she had not earned, dependent on a man who owed her nothing. Gratitude tasted sharp when mixed with pride. She could not let herself drift forever as a guest. The thought pricked her with every step she took across the yard, every glance she cast at the sturdy house or the red barn. Even as the warmth of safety wrapped around her, another voice inside whispered that safety had a price and she could not pay it. That morning, with Ruth still sleeping, Clara moved barefoot into the barn. The scent of hay horses and wood greeted her like a grounding reminder of the present. She seized the broom and set to work sweeping the dust, scattering feed-hauling buckets of water. Her muscles ached, her knuckles burned, but with each task she felt closer to proving she belonged not as a beggar, but as a woman pulling her own weight. When Thomas appeared in the barn doorway, he leaned against the frame, his hat low, his shirt sleeves rolled. He watched quietly, not with criticism, but with a patience that unsettled her. At last his voice broke the silence, rough from sleep but steady. "You don't have to." Clara stiffened, clutching the broom as if it were a shield. "I can't just sit idle," she answered, her words sharp to hide the tremor beneath them. "You're not idle," Thomas said, nodding toward the house where Ruth still lay asleep. "You've got enough to tend." His tone carried no judgment, but to Clara it landed like a reminder of her place dependent, surviving because he had chosen to open his doors. The unease twisted tighter in her stomach. The silence stretched. She wanted to argue, to insist she must work, must earn every bite of bread, every sip of water. She could not bear the thought of being seen as a burden. But Thomas's next words cut through all of it, simple and unadorned, yet heavier than any sermon or gossip. "You don't owe me." The broom slipped slightly in Clara's grip. She stared at him, unsteady, because the sentence cracked open a cage she had lived in for years. Her whole life had been measured in debts, to men who left to strangers, who judged, to the gnawing voice inside that said she was never enough unless she repaid every kindness twice over. But Thomas stood there immovable, offering no ledger, demanding no balance. The words stripped away the weight of apology, of shame. For a moment Clara felt both naked and free. She turned from him, tears pricking her eyes, unable to speak. Thomas did not press closer. He only walked toward the corral, shoulders squared against the horizon, moving like a man who knew that truth once given needed space to take root. Clara's chest rose and fell with a new rhythm. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine that kindness did not always carry chains, and that perhaps, just perhaps, home could begin here. The next test came not from the land, but from the voices that thrived on small-town walls and narrow eyes. Clara needed flour, soap, and thread, small things that marked survival. With Ruth's thin hand clasped in hers, she walked into the mercantile, her shoulders square, though her heart thudded against her ribs. The store smelled of dust and starch jars lined up in soldierly rows. But the silence broke almost immediately into murmurs. Whispers flitted like insects, widow shame, living off a man already. A woman near the fabric bolts tilted her chin and muttered about impropriety, the way strays always latched onto ranchers. A man at the counter smirked and spoke low, but loud enough widows with wandering eyes. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, her palm firm on Ruth's shoulder. Pride was all she had left to wear. At the counter, she laid down the few coins Thomas had pressed into her hand that morning. The shopkeeper, thin with wire spectacles and a pinched expression, hesitated before taking them, as though her money carried the stain of gossip. The moment stretched taut. Clara could feel the stares behind her, every breath of judgment pressing down like the desert heat she thought she'd escaped. Her pride warred with her need. Ruth tugged gently at her skirt, eyes wide, silent plea shining through exhaustion. Then a shadow fell across the floor. Clara turned, startled to find Thomas standing tall beside her. She hadn't realized he had followed. He didn't glare at the whispering women or rebuke the smirking man. He didn't waste breath defending what needed no defense. Instead, he laid a steady hand against the small of Clara's back, anchoring her, his presence like a wall against the storm. His voice, when it came, was quiet but edged with unshakable certainty. "Put it on my account." The shopkeeper blinked, then nodded quickly, scribbling in his ledger, with hands that suddenly seemed eager to obey. The gossip evaporated into silence, swallowed by the weight of Thomas's presence. He didn't explain. He didn't excuse. He simply stood there, an unmoving fact no rumor could erode. Clara swallowed the protest rising in her throat, that she could pay her own way, that she was no one's burden. Ruth pressed closer, relieved, and the words withered unspoken. Together they left the mercantile. The whispers no longer mattered. Clara felt the warmth of Thomas's hand still lingering at her back, and for the first time the wind that had always pushed against her now felt as if she had a shield, a strong back to lean into. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and Ruth played in the dust with a stick, Clara sat on the porch, her chest heavy with unspoken dread. The weight of whispers from town still clung to her. She turned to Thomas, voice raw with fear. "You'll ruin yourself if you keep us here. Food, shelter, safety. They'll say I've trapped you, that I'm bleeding you dry." Thomas did not look startled, nor did he rush to soothe her with empty words. He set aside the tool he had been sharpening, his hands steady, his eyes catching the last glow of dusk. His voice came slow, deliberate, each word landing like the strike of a hammer. "What they say doesn't matter." Clara's throat tightened. "Then what does she ask?" The question barely above a whisper. He turned fully toward her, gaze, unflinching tone, weighted with quiet conviction. "What matters is what's true, and the truth is, you've carried more than most men could bear. You are not a burden, Clara. You are a blessing." The words struck her like a storm breaking over dry ground. For so long she had lived as if her worth were measured by lack, by hunger, by shame, by what others believed she could not provide. To hear the opposite spoken with such certainty made her breath falter. Her heart thudded painfully, almost unwilling to believe. Ruth's laughter carried through the yard light, and untamed as if the child already knew what her mother still fought to accept. Clara lowered her gaze, then lifted it again, drawn back to Thomas's unwavering steadiness. Their hands brushed on the porch rail, no grasp, no claim, only the quiet weight of presence. It was not a vow, not yet. But in that simple touch lay the promise of shelter, not from duty but from choice. The night broke open with thunder. Rain lashed the roof, rattling windows and soaking the earth until it smelled of rebirth. Lightning split the sky into jagged silver, and in the dim cabin Ruth woke with a cry, her small body trembling against Clara's chest. Before Clara could gather herself, Thomas entered, coat damp, his face lit in flashes of stormlight. Without hesitation, he lifted Ruth into his arms, carrying her with a gentleness that felt almost reverent. He settled into the rocking chair, his broad frame curving around the child, humming low and steady until her sobs eased. Each sway of the chair, each whispered murmur, was a gift freely given by a man who owed nothing and yet gave everything. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sight, the strength of him, holding the fragility of her world as if it were sacred. By morning, the storm had passed. The air was washed, clean fields sparkling beneath a pale sun. Ruth ran barefoot through the wet grass, her laughter spilling like birdsong, chasing chickens, shaking water from their feathers. Clara stood beside Thomas at the fence, the hem of her dress still damp. Her heart hammered with a decision too long delayed. Her voice was soft, trembling, but unshakable. "Ruth needs a home." "And I." The words caught, tangled in pride and longing. Thomas turned, his eyes steady. The lines of his face softened. "Then stay," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "Not as a guest, not as a burden, as my wife." The world stilled. Clara's tears fell not from despair but release, as the promise of belonging finally took shape in words. The wedding was not adorned with grandeur, but with quiet certainty. Thomas sent for the preacher with no announcement, no spectacle, only the gravity of a man who knew his choice and meant it. A hired hand and a sharp-eyed neighbor woman stood as witnesses, their presence plain, yet weighty, the kind of testimony that mattered more than a crowd. Clara wore a simple white dress, the fabric soft and modest, bartered quietly by Thomas in town, days earlier. He had spoken no word about it, but the gesture carried its own vow. He had seen her not as a burden to be covered in pity, but as a bride worthy of dignity. Her hair was brushed loose, her cheeks touched with color, not from rouge but from tears that brimmed without shame. Thomas stood tall beside her, hat in hand, his eyes steady as the preacher's words bound them. When the vows were spoken, he did not embellish, did not gild his promise, only delivered it in the plain cadence of truth. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ruth squealed with delight, circling them with the laughter of a child who at last had a home. Thomas bent and kissed Clara's forehead. It was not a kiss of conquest nor display, but of reverence. Their joy was not loud but enduring, born of mercy, patience, and the kind of love that weathers storms rather than burns out. They both knew the truth. The whispers of town would not vanish with vows, nor would the lands suddenly ease. Droughts would come, storms would tear roofs from barns, and gossip would cling like dust. But Clara no longer carried her load alone. What stretched before her was not the mirage of rescue, but the steady reality of a companion, Thomas, whose presence meant she did not have to survive by stubborn pride alone. He was not a savior sweeping her from ruin, but a partner who chose to walk the same hard ground at her side. That night, when the day's toil had softened into silence, the prairie opened wide above them. Stars scattered across the sky like grains of salt spilled on black velvet, endless and humbling. Clara stood on the porch, Ruth asleep, safe inside the night air, cool on her cheeks. She turned to Thomas, her voice barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. "You were there," she said, her throat tightening, "when the world would have let us die." The weight of her words lingered in the vastness. Thomas slid his arm around her shoulders, pulling her gently against his solid frame. His reply was quiet, almost rough with conviction, but it struck deeper than any shouted oath. "And I'll still be here," he said. The night stretched around them, vast and unending, yet no longer empty. In its silence lay the promise of 1,000 tomorrows not yet written, but already theirs to walk. Under the great western sky, what had begun as survival now unfolded into belonging, a bond tempered by hardship and sealed with the certainty of endurance.